Imagine standing on the edge of a cliff in Scotland, the wind biting against your skin, the sea below thrashing itself into madness. Now imagine that the rocks beneath your feet are not stone at all, but bone. Bone stacked so deep it mimics the very earth. This is not folklore. If you dare to face the truth behind this story, hit that subscribe button now and press the bell icon, because the next revelation should reach you before anyone else. This is not a fairy tale designed to frighten children. This is the unmarked cemetery of 1,600 human beings, stripped of flesh, stripped of dignity, stripped even of memory. The church denied it. The crown erased it. But the echoes remain. You can still feel them if you stand there long enough, as if the ground itself remembers what it swallowed. And tonight, you're going to remember it too. Because this is not just the story of Sawney Bean, the so-called patriarch of Scotland's most infamous cannibal clan. No, brother. This is a blueprint of something far darker, of how a family became an institution of horror, how secrecy became a weapon, and how hunger transformed into theology. You've been told this was an anomaly. You've been told this was savagery at the edges of civilization. But I'm here to tell you, it was neither. It was design, and the design still breathes. Sawney Bean's story is a mirror, not of monsters in caves, but of systems in plain sight. Systems that manipulate, dominate, and consume, while the world above pretends not to see. This is not a story of the past. It's a story of right now, disguised in myth so you wouldn't recognize the architecture of your own captivity. That's why the records were sealed. That's why the evidence was burned. Not because the crown feared cannibals, but because they feared recognition. Recognition that what lived in those caves was not the collapse of civilization, but its reflection. And before we descend, you need to understand this. Once you hear the truth, you can't unhear it. Once you see the pattern, it will never leave your eyes. This is forbidden history, the kind of knowledge that changes a man forever. And if you stay with me, you will not leave as the same man who clicked play. You will walk away marked, altered, initiated. And that, my friend, is exactly why you were never supposed to hear this story. They will tell you Sawney Bean was born a bastard, the unwanted son of a ditch digger, spat out into a Scotland already burning with witch trials and civil bloodshed. But what they will not tell you is that his first breath was pulled through smoke and screams, his mother accused of sorcery, burned alive while still carrying him inside her, dragged from her corpse, and raised as something less than human. And if you believe monsters are born, you will miss the truth. That monsters are forged, hammered in fire and humiliation, shaped by a society that denies dignity, until all that is left is hunger and rage. And Sawney learned early that the law was never written for men like him. That morality was a leash placed only around the necks of the powerless, so he slipped it, vanished into the cliffs with a woman named Agnes. Some whisper his sister, others claim his lover, both true in a way, because she was the only soul who recognized in him the same hunger for inversion, for building not a family, but a doctrine, not a household, but a fortress of appetite. And together they fled into the coastal darkness, where sea foam masked their footsteps and stone swallowed their voices. A cave carved by tide into a cathedral of secrecy, a place where the outside world could not reach. And there they began their gospel, not of God, but of flesh, of blood, of silence. And their children were not born into society, but into a system, raised to know no mercy, no love, no innocence, only obedience and appetite. And this is the detail polite history hides, that the Bean clan was not madness at all, but method, not chaos, but structure, because every tyrant knows this truth. Isolate the young, starve them of choice, poison them with fear, and you can shape not one generation, but a lineage, a self-contained machinery of loyalty. And by the time Scotland awoke to what was happening, by the time whispers turned into panic, It was too late. Because Sawney and Agnes had already built something stronger than a family, they had built an empire of hunger, hidden beneath the waves, a kingdom of predators operating in perfect silence while the world above congratulated itself on its order, never realizing the real order was being written in blood just beneath their feet. For 25 years, the roads between Gervin and Ballantrae became veins feeding into the mouth of that cave, travelers vanishing without echo, families swallowed whole, merchants erased from their roots as if history itself had decided to skip their names. And yet no alarms were raised, no armies dispatched, because disappearance is easy to dismiss when it is scattered and quiet, because the crown only counts the missing when they are noble, and the church only mourns the dead when they tithe. And so the poor, the wandering, the forgotten became fodder, flesh harvested in silence, their cries smothered beneath the tide, their bones stored in tunnels, salted with decay, until the number reached 1,600, and still no one spoke of patterns, because men are trained to look away, to dismiss what does not serve their comfort, and this blindness is not an accident. It is the oldest control system of all, to convince the masses that horror exists only in stories, never in stone, never in the smell of smoke that drifts inland on certain nights, never in the way families prayed harder when crossing the coastal roads. And Sawney knew this. He thrived on it, turning human flesh into ritual, every butchered corpse into sermon, every silence into scripture. Because for him and his brood, the hunt was not madness but liturgy, a theology of appetite where eating was communion and dismemberment was prayer. And the children born inside that cave never questioned, never doubted, for how could they, when they had never known another world, their language stripped of words like friend or future, replaced with flesh and hunger, their games nothing but stalking, their toys nothing but bones polished into ornaments. And this is why the Bean clan endured so long. Because they created a prison so complete, the prisoners didn't know they were trapped, a cycle of isolation so total that escape was not only forbidden, it was unimaginable. And this, my brother, is the same structure you live inside now. For though your walls are not stone and your air is not salt, you too are raised in a system that edits language, that dictates what you may dream, what you may question, what you may resist. And while you laugh at the cannibals in the cave, you do not see the cave around your own mind, built by institutions that feed not on your flesh, but on your obedience. And in this truth lies the real horror. Sawney Bean was not an aberration. He was a prototype. The Bean clan's cave was more than a hiding place. It was an institution, a fortress of indoctrination, where Agnes bore 14 children, and those children bred with each other until nearly 50 pale, silent figures moved as one body, bound not by love, but by blood, by fear, by appetite, and every newborn was initiated the same way, not with lullabies, but with screams, not with baptismal water, but with the taste of human marrow pressed against their lips before they could speak. And soon dismemberment became their first skill, silence their first law, obedience their first religion, and within those walls words like mercy or hope were forbidden, replaced by commands etched in hunger, and time itself broke down. No seasons, no calendars, only the endless cycle of ambush, slaughter, smoke, and feasting. And though history brands them monsters, I tell you, they were something far worse. They were engineers, architects of psychological control, crafting a lineage where loyalty was not chosen, but bred, where identity was swallowed before it could even form. And this is why the cave still whispers in legend, because it was not just a tomb. It was a laboratory, and what they discovered is still practiced in different forms today, in orphanages that strip children of choice, in schools that cut curiosity from the tongue, in institutions that convince you your cage is safety, your obedience is virtue. And if you think Sawney's cave has been sealed, you are blind, because the structure repeats again and again in every closed system where questioning is punished, where conformity is rewarded, where language itself is bent to erase freedom. And so the Bean clan were not simply predators, they were a mirror held up to power itself, a grotesque foreshadowing of the prisons you walk inside daily without seeing the bars. And this is the forbidden truth, the dangerous knowledge you woo. They're never meant to hear. Cannibalism was only their surface sin. The deeper crime was mastery of control, a system that could erase individuality, kill memory, harvest obedience, and call it survival. And if you think that died with them, if you think fire and rope ended it, you have already been fooled, for systems that efficient are never destroyed, only adapted, only disguised, waiting for the next generation of the blind to become the next feast. For years, no one dared question why the roads bled travelers into silence, why caravans vanished as though swallowed by the earth. Because the Bean clan perfected not only the art of hunting, but the art of erasure, striking with precision and retreating into darkness, leaving no trace but whispers. And so Scotland became a land haunted by absence, every missing merchant a rumor, every unreturned family a fading echo, until fear itself became currency, traded in taverns as ghost stories, but never brought to the ears of power. For peasants feared ridicule more than death, and kings feared scandal more than truth. And this is how institutions have always functioned, brother. Not by solving horrors, but by denying them. Not by protecting you, but by protecting themselves. And while the bodies rotted in a pit beneath the sea, the church burned witches in the square and congratulated itself on righteousness, while the crown raised armies to crush rebels, but never raised a finger to search for the hundreds vanishing on their own roads, because horror hidden is horror controlled. And as long as the fear was whispered instead of shouted, Sawney and his brood thrived, growing into a community so insular that escape was unthinkable, their children trained in silence, their rituals honed to perfection, until the cave itself seemed alive, a living organism of shadows that devoured everything fed to it. And here lies the revelation. This family was not a mistake in history. They were a proof of concept, a demonstration of how quickly human beings can be bent into something unrecognizable when isolation is absolute, when indoctrination is generational. And if you listen carefully, you will see the same design operating around you now, in the doctrines you inherit without questioning, in the loyalties you never chose but obey anyway, in the systems that tell you what is safe, what is true, what is real, while feeding on your submission. And so the true terror of the Bean clan is not the piles of bones left to rot in brine, but the knowledge that they showed us a map, a hidden instruction of how to build an obedient society from flesh and fear, and others, far more powerful than Sawney Bean, took note. By the time King James V learned the truth, it was already a nightmare beyond comprehension. A cave so meticulously hidden that even soldiers with hounds and torches struggled to locate its mouth, a labyrinth of stone and tide where 1,600 souls had been fed into a machine of consumption, and yet when the soldiers finally breached the darkness, they found not chaos but order, pale eyes reflecting firelight, children standing in rows, adults seated on thrones of bone, the air thick with the scent of smoke, marrow, and decay, and there was no panic, no pleas, only the calm certainty of beings who had never known another life, who had never questioned obedience because obedience was all that defined them. And as the crown attempted to arrest, chain, and execute, Sawney's smile cut deeper than any blade, a smile that carried the weight of philosophy, the reflection of an entire system perfected over decades, a system where fear had been normalized, where hunger had become ritual, where domination had been internalized as identity, and the horror is not only in the cannibalism, but in the methodical intelligence, the deliberate engineering of minds that never knew mercy, never tasted love, never experienced play. For each child was a node in a network, each adult a priest of a doctrine that inverted civilization, teaching that to take life was to claim power, that consumption was communion, and in witnessing this, the soldiers, hardened men, faltered, vomited, screamed internally, because what they faced was not merely brutality. It was a living testament to how systems shape behavior, how isolation breeds perfection in obedience, how generations can be molded in the absence of outside influence. And if you think this was just history, you are missing the lesson. For the blueprint Sawney created is not dead. It has only evolved, woven into institutions, families, and societies in forms far subtler, waiting to be recognized, waiting to remind you that the architecture of control is always around you, and that the lesson of the Bean clan is not that monsters existed, but that monsters can be manufactured silently, deliberately. And the most terrifying part of all is that you may already live inside one without knowing it. Even after the executions, even after fire consumed flesh and rope tore sinew, the ideology of the Bean clan did not vanish. It metastasized, scattering into shadows carried by those who had escaped notice, children too young to be accounted for, adolescents hidden by the tide or the mist, and with each hidden survivor, the teachings adapted, mutated, became stealthier, more insidious, no longer confined to a cave but embedded into households, apprenticeships, even institutions where the veneer of civility concealed the predator, and over decades the descendants learned to mask hunger with charm, to cloak violence in respectability, to disguise doctrine as propriety. And this is the terrifying truth they never wanted you to see. Power does not die. It evolves. It hides behind etiquette. It operates under law. It infiltrates. It seduces. And what began as ritualistic consumption became the mastery of influence, of obedience, of control. The same principles applied whether eating flesh or consuming wills, and so the Bean legacy seeped into society, into families, into hidden societies that worship secrecy, hierarchy, and domination. And those who think they are safe in the light of law or religion are merely ignorant of the architecture that surrounds them, because the system that Sawney and Agnes perfected, the isolation, the indoctrination, the generational loyalty, the ritualized enforcement of hierarchy, was a template for power itself, one that the crown feared and tried to erase but could not fully contain, and the barrels removed under royal supervision, supposedly bones or records, were evidence that even men of authority understood the threat. Ideas cannot be burned, doctrines cannot be executed, and once implanted in minds, they reproduce silently, like spores in the dark, waiting, always waiting. And as you hear this, remember, you are listening not only to his Tory, but to a manual for human control disguised as legend, a reminder that hunger is not always for food, that obedience can be cultivated, and that the darkest lessons are rarely written in law. They are etched in behavior, in fear, in silence, and now that you know, the world above the cave, the world that claims safety and order, is already part of the experiment, and you must ask yourself, what have you been taught to consume, and who has been consuming you? What makes the Bean clan truly terrifying is not simply the number of victims or the grotesque rituals. They were meticulous, patient, and cunning beyond imagination. For over decades they observed human patterns, studied roots, exploited vulnerabilities, and understood instinct with the precision of generals, learning that fear itself is a weapon, that silence amplifies authority, and that the most obedient followers are those who are never shown alternatives, and as their children grew, they were trained to anticipate, to strategize, to strike with efficiency, and yet to the outside world, they were ghosts, myths, whispers in taverns, tales parents told to frighten their children into caution, while the true terror moved among them unseen, their doctrine propagating in hidden corners, in barns, in basements, in forests, where travelers disappeared and no one asked why. And here lies the deeper horror. What begins as physical domination, taking bodies, evolves into psychological mastery, shaping minds, rewriting what is acceptable, desirable, and permissible. And while Scotland believed it had eradicated the clan, the surviving children carried their system into anonymity, into society, blending, adapting, wearing masks of civility, of education, of respectability, while underneath remained the same principles, applied not only to survival, but to influence, persuasion, control, the perfection of obedience through fear and reward. And so the lesson of Sawney Bean is not just historical. It is practical, present, and uncomfortably close, because any closed system that isolates, indoctrinates, and reinforces hierarchy can reproduce his results without a cave, without knives, without ritualistic feasts. And the real nightmare is that humans are capable of constructing these systems willingly, embedding them in culture, institutions, and families, all under the guise of safety or tradition. And now that you understand the method, the machinery, the architecture of control, you cannot unsee it. And this knowledge alone is dangerous, because once a man perceives the framework, he either submits, becomes complicit, or resists. And resistance demands awareness, courage, and the willingness to look into the dark corners of his own world, where the descendants of the Bean clan, literal or ideological, may still watch, still teach, still feed, not on flesh, but on conformity, obedience, and submission, and that is the lesson hidden in plain sight. Power, like hunger, never dies. It merely waits for the next generation to consume. By the late 1700s, whispers of disappearances and spirals etched in stone began to rise again along the Scottish coastline, faint traces of a terror thought extinguished. And while authorities dismissed them as superstition, those who lived near the cliffs remembered. Parents warned their children. Shepherds noticed strange patterns in the mist. Merchants reported missing goods and missing travelers, and these were not random acts, but echoes of a system designed to perpetuate itself, a doctrine of hunger and obedience that had learned to adapt, to conceal, to infiltrate. And as the world above busied itself with law, commerce, and civility, the descendants of Sawney Bean moved among them, taking new names, inhabiting new roles, embedding the same principles in subtle forms. And the horror is not in the knife or the pit, but in the structure. Children raised in secrecy, trained to obey, taught to strike only when unseen, indoctrinated to normalize cruelty, to recognize authority in the guise of any mask, to internalize rules written not by morality but by survival. And so when someone disappeared near Agnes in 1823, or a red-haired child vanished from an orphanage in Edinburgh decades later, it was not madness or coincidence. It was methodology, a continuation of the system, proving that a doctrine rooted in fear and obedience does not die in fire, does not vanish with execution. It simply disperses, multiplies quietly, hidden in plain sight, morphing to fit new times and new societies. And this is the lesson you must understand. The Bean clan's true power was never in cannibalism alone. It was in teaching human minds to accept their chains, to obey rituals without questioning, to turn hunger into doctrine, to internalize hierarchy as identity. And this is the blueprint repeated wherever authority hides its methods behind civility, wherever obedience is cultivated as virtue, wherever fear is normalized as discipline. And now that you see it, you can never forget it, because knowledge of the system binds you differently, awakens a responsibility, forces you to recognize the cages around you, the silent predators in society who do not need knives to dominate, only the careful cultivation of obedience, secrecy, and fear. And the true horror is this: the world is full of such systems, the descendants of Sawney Bean, not always in caves, sometimes in plain sight, and understanding this is the first step in either survival or complicity, and the line between the two is thinner than you dare imagine. The further you descend into this history, the clearer it becomes that Sawney Bean was not merely a monster of flesh, but a master architect of control, teaching his children to move as one, to anticipate, to silence instinctual doubt, to see the world as prey and obedience as law. And this methodology extended beyond the cave, into memory, into culture, into collective fear. For when the Crown tried to erase the clan, when fire and rope attempted to annihilate what they could see, they failed to destroy the underlying system, the architecture of indoctrination, and the survivors, those too young or too cunning to be executed, carried the principles outward, hidden under new names, under polite disguises, into institutions, families, and communities, adapting, evolving, teaching new generations the unspoken rules of hierarchy, ritual, and dominance. And you must understand this, brother. The horror is not always visible, not always bloody. It is structural, systemic, psychological, and everywhere you accept hierarchy without questioning, fear without analyzing, obedience without thought, you are walking within the same blueprint, obeying rituals you do not fully comprehend, reinforcing doctrines you cannot see, and the Bean clan's genius, if one could call it that, was in showing how absolute obedience could be manufactured, passed through bloodlines, and reinforced through fear, silence, and isolation. A terrifying demonstration of how humanity can be molded into instruments of domination when the right conditions are met, and the lessons are etched in every vanished traveler, every unsolved disappearance, every whisper of white-eyed children in the night, every spiral carved into bark or stone as a calling card, a reminder that control is eternal, adaptation is inevitable, and that even after centuries, the system can reproduce silently, invisibly, perfectly. And now that you know, you must look at the world differently, for the descendants of the Bean clan, literal or ideological, may walk beside you, sitting quietly in offices, schools, families, communities, executing rituals you cannot see, teaching obedience you cannot question, and the blood of history, the blueprint of control, still pulses quietly beneath the surface of everyday life, waiting for those who dare not see, for the next cycle, the next prey, the next obedience. By the mid-1800s, disappearances along the Scottish coast became statistically undeniable. 32 people vanished in just over a year. Travelers, merchants, children, none ever found, and authorities scrambled for explanations, blaming weather, shipwrecks, wolves, or madness. But locals knew better, whispering of gutted deer, of spiral patterns carved overnight into stones, of screams carried on the wind that sounded too human. And somewhere in that mist, the surviving doctrine of the Bean clan persisted, carried quietly by descendants who had learned the lessons of survival, secrecy, and manipulation, blending into society, taking positions of influence, learning to hide the same instincts under masks of respectability, kindness, civility. And this is where the lesson becomes personal. The architecture of control that Sawney and Agnes perfected is not unique to cannibalism or caves. It is a formula, one that can be applied to families, institutions, governments, schools, religious organizations, and corporations. And once you understand the method, the terrifying realization hits. You may already be living inside such a system, obeying rules you never questioned, internalizing hierarchies you never analyzed, and contributing unknowingly to the perpetuation of doctrines designed to normalize compliance and silence dissent. And the brilliance of the Bean clan, horrifying as it was, lies in this. They demonstrated how fear, isolation, ritual, and indoctrination could create a closed system where the participants themselves enforce obedience, creating a cycle of power that is self-sustaining, invisible to outsiders. And now, centuries later, the echoes remain, hiding in folklore, in cultural marrow, in the nightmares of those who sense but cannot see, in the subtle hierarchies that govern human behavior, in the psychological manipulation embedded into structures around you. And the moment you recognize this blueprint, the moment you see the threads connecting history, fear, obedience, and power, you are changed forever, because knowledge of the system forces awareness, and awareness forces responsibility. And the descendants of Sawney Bean, literal or ideological, still walk among us, still teach the same principles, now cloaked in civility, their doctrine alive, evolving, invisible. And as you hear this, you must ask yourself, what obedience are you practicing? Who taught you to follow without question? And who, in your life, is feeding on that compliance? As decades passed, the story of Sawney Bean transformed from terrifying legend into almost mythic folklore. Yet the reality behind the myth never truly ended. Survivors of the clan, too cunning to be extinguished by fire or rope, carried the principles outward, embedding the doctrines of obedience, hierarchy, and silent domination into new families, trades, and institutions. teaching in subtle ways that the control of minds can be more powerful than the control of bodies. And by the 19th century, disappearances, mysterious murders, and inexplicable patterns of submission continued in pockets along Scotland's coasts. Red-haired children vanishing, merchants never returning, symbols of spirals carved in trees or stone as quiet signatures of presence and authority. And it is here you must understand the lesson, brother. The Bean clan was not merely a story of grotesque cannibalism. It was a demonstration of systematized control, a living laboratory of fear and obedience, and the survivors, whether hidden in anonymity or disguised under new identities, adapted the methods to fit the modern world, teaching children to obey, families to conform, communities to submit, all under the guise of civility, tradition, or education. So the blueprint is still active, invisible to the unaware, operating in the structures of society that demand conformity without question. And the real horror is this: these systems do not need knives, fire, or bones to survive. They operate in silence, shaping behavior, directing loyalty, cultivating obedience, and once you perceive the design, you begin to notice it everywhere, within your institutions, within the families you trust, within yourself, in the habits and rules you follow without scrutiny. And the terrifying reality of the Bean legacy is that it teaches how to manufacture obedience, instill fear, perpetuate hierarchy, and control generations. Stands quietly so that the descendants, literal or ideological, may walk among us today, smiling, polite, civilized, and yet every move, every decision, every ritual is calibrated to maintain authority, ensure compliance, and feed on the submission of others. And now that you see it, there is no unseeing, only awareness. And with awareness comes choice, responsibility, and the knowledge that the same principles that once created a kingdom of flesh and shadow can exist anywhere. Obedience is demanded, fear is normalized, and curiosity is suppressed. By the turn of the 20th century, the notion that the Bean clan's terror had ended was nothing more than comforting fiction. The system they had built, perfected over decades of isolation, ritual, and bloodline loyalty, had not been destroyed, only dispersed. And those who survived, whether as children hidden during the raids or as adults who slipped away unnoticed, carried forward the teachings, subtle but unbroken, teaching obedience, hierarchy, and the normalization of fear to new generations under new names, in quiet trades, in orphanages, in merchant families, in secret societies, and everywhere they went. The methodology endured, invisible yet operative, so that disappearances continued. Rumors of spirals carved into stone, of missing travelers, of strange patterns of behavior in children, all signals of the same underlying system. And this is where the horror shifts from body to mind. The clan had proven that the architecture of control does not need blood or knives to perpetuate itself, that obedience can be cultivated, fear normalized, hierarchy internalized, and loyalty manufactured silently over decades. And when you begin to perceive this framework, you realize it is not confined to Scottish caves, but exists in countless forms across societies, in families, schools, religious institutions, corporations, governments, and communities, where rules are obeyed without question, rituals enforced without understanding, fear internalized as discipline, and authority obeyed blindly. And the legacy of Sawney Bean is not just a historical footnote, it is a living manual of human manipulation, demonstrating the terrifying potential of structured obedience and invisible control. And now, centuries later, the descendants, both literal and ideological, walk among us, polite, educated, and civilized, hiding the same instincts, the same principles, the same hunger for dominance. Their methods evolved to fit modernity, their doctrines silent but pervasive, teaching that to consume is not always to devour flesh, but to shape thought, to erase autonomy, to replace the will of another with the will of the system. And as you listen to this, you must recognize the warning. Control is eternal, influence is invisible, obedience is cultivated. and the blueprint of fear and hierarchy that once fed on bodies can now feed on minds, silently, perfectly, anywhere conformity is demanded and curiosity suppressed. Into the early 1900s, the evidence of the Bean clan's enduring methodology became increasingly subtle yet undeniable, as stories of missing children, mysterious disappearances, and unexplained violence continued to circulate along the coasts and inland villages of Scotland, often dismissed by authorities as accidents, superstition, or the randomness of life. But to those who understood, the patterns were unmistakable. The clan's blueprint of control, indoctrination, and fear had not ended with fire or rope. It had mutated, adapted, and dispersed into anonymity, and the descendants, some literal, some ideological, taught obedience without explicit instruction, loyalty without recognition, and fear without overt threat, embedding the system into households, trades, institutions, and communities, normalizing behavior that mirrored the original clan's teachings. And this is where the true terror of Sawney Bean's legacy becomes personal, because the clan had demonstrated that absolute obedience could be manufactured, passed from one generation to another, reinforced through subtle ritual, enforced hierarchy, and isolation. And once that system is internalized, it becomes self-sustaining, invisible to outsiders, and terrifyingly efficient, teaching those within that fear is safety, submission is virtue, and obedience is survival. And in modern times, the same principles manifest not through dismembered bodies, but through silent manipulation, control of resources, psychological coercion, and cultural reinforcement, ensuring that those who follow rarely question, those who resist are marginalized, and the doctrine continues, unseen but operative, as a lesson in human behavior perfected over centuries, a demonstration that power does not require visibility, that influence does not require brutality, and that the descendants of the Bean clan, in all forms, continue to walk among us, hidden behind civility, education, and respectability, shaping minds, reinforcing obedience, and feeding silently on submission. And now that you understand this, you must recognize the architecture of control not as a relic of history, but as a living system, present, active, and terrifyingly efficient. Because the true legacy of Sawney Bean is not the blood that stained his cave, but the system of dominance, fear, and obedience that endures, always waiting, always watching, always teaching. By the mid-20th century, the tale of Sawney Bean had long been relegated to folklore, yet the echoes of his clan's methodology persisted, embedded invisibly in the veins of society, in institutions, in families, in the rituals and hierarchies that demand compliance without question. And while historians dismiss the legacy as myth, the descendants, both literal and ideological, had adapted to a modern world, teaching obedience in subtle, insidious ways, guiding behavior, shaping thought, cultivating loyalty and fear without overt violence. And here lies the chilling truth. The Bean clan's genius was never in the act of cannibalism alone, but in demonstrating that control, once perfected, is self-perpetuating, invisible, and absolute. And as the decades passed, disappearances transformed into metaphorical consumption, not of flesh, but of autonomy, free will, and identity, where individuals unknowingly enforce doctrines, hierarchies, and rituals, perpetuating a cycle of obedience that could exist anywhere. Conformity is demanded, fear normalized, and dissent discouraged. And the lesson for you, watching now, is immediate and personal, because the architecture of control the Bean clan perfected centuries ago exists today in subtle, silent forms, within corporations, governments, religious organizations, and even families. And to recognize it is to awaken to a reality where power is exercised invisibly, influence is absolute, and the same principles that once created a kingdom of flesh now shape behavior, belief, and loyalty without ever drawing blood. And the horror is not just in the past. It is ongoing, operating quietly, effectively, and invisibly, teaching that obedience, fear, and hierarchy are tools of control, that submission is harvested, and that the descendants of the Bean clan, cloaked in civility, respectability, and anonymity, continue to refine the system, ensuring that the human mind remains the ultimate prey, the vessel for their doctrine. And now that you see it, you cannot unsee it, because knowledge itself is a weapon, and awareness of the structure of domination forever alters your perception of society, of institutions, of the people around you, and most importantly, of yourself. As the 20th century advanced, the lessons of the Bean clan became increasingly abstract yet more insidious, manifesting not in the bloody rituals of old, but in the subtle manipulation of minds, the quiet enforcement of obedience, and the normalization of fear as a tool of control. And the descendants, hidden, educated, assimilated into society, perfected the art of invisibility, teaching generations to submit without question, to internalize hierarchy as natural law, and to enforce loyalty silently, shaping communities and institutions from within. And this is where the true horror lies. Sawney Bean's legacy was never merely about consumption of flesh. It was about consumption of agency, identity, and free will, demonstrating that power, once internalized, need not strike visibly to dominate utterly. And by mid-century, disappearances, mysterious deaths, psychological manipulation, and untraceable acts of coercion echoed the same architecture of control, proving that a doctrine of obedience and fear can survive centuries, adapt to new environments, and hide behind the veneer of civility, education, and respectability. And now you must understand that this is not just history. It is a template, a blueprint for invisible dominance that exists wherever compliance is demanded, curiosity suppressed, and authority unchallenged. A system that can operate in families, schools, corporations, governments, or religious institutions, perpetuating itself silently while appearing natural. And the terrifying reality is that the descendants, literal or ideological, walk among us, invisible yet potent, shaping behavior, loyalty, and thought without ever revealing their hand. And the moment you recognize the pattern, the structures, the subtle enforcement of obedience, you begin to see the world differently. Understand that horror need not be grotesque or visible to be complete, and that the greatest legacy of Sawney Bean is not the pit, the cave, or the blood. It is the understanding that control, fear, and obedience can be taught, perpetuated, and perfected across generations, quietly, invisibly, unchallenged, and still devastatingly effective. By the latter half of the 20th century, the influence of the Bean clan had become almost entirely invisible, yet its architecture of control persisted, woven into the very fabric of society, operating not through brute force or bloodshed, but through psychological manipulation, institutionalized obedience, and the subtle reinforcement of hierarchy and fear. And the descendants, both literal and ideological, had perfected the art of blending in, embedding the principles of dominance, loyalty, and submission into schools, families, corporations, and governments, teaching each generation to obey without question, to enforce rules without understanding, and to fear without reason. And this is where the real terror of Sawney Bean's legacy emerges. It is not the acts themselves that endure, but the system, a self-perpetuating mechanism of control capable of shaping behavior, thought, and identity invisibly, silently, yet completely. And as you observe the world today, patterns emerge if you look closely. The unquestioned rules, the rituals disguised as tradition, the hierarchies internalized as natural law, the silent enforcement of compliance, and in these, the shadow of the Bean clan lingers, demonstrating that the methodology perfected in a cave centuries ago is still relevant, still powerful, and still effective, teaching that dominance can be achieved without violence, that fear can be internalized, that obedience can be self-enforced, and that the descendants, hidden behind civility, education, and respectability, continue to refine and transmit this system, ensuring that control is maintained, autonomy consumed, and submission harvested. And now that you recognize this, you must confront a stark reality. The horror of Sawney Bean is not just historical. It is structural, psychological, and eternal, waiting quietly in every institution, every family, every system where conformity is demanded and questioning discouraged, and once seen, once understood, the world can never be perceived the same way again, because the blueprint of fear, obedience, and silent dominance is still active, still evolving, still feeding on the unawareness of those who walk blindly through its invisible corridors. As the 21st century unfolded, the legacy of Sawney Bean had become a ghostly current running beneath the surface of civilization, almost imperceptible yet profoundly influential, manifesting not through caves, knives, or open violence, but through the quiet enforcement of compliance, the normalization of fear, and the subtle structuring of hierarchy in every institution. And the descendants, now fully assimilated, educated, and indistinguishable from society at large, had refined the methods, teaching obedience, shaping loyalty, and directing behavior through invisible channels, social constructs, and psychological pressure, ensuring that every generation internalized the principles of submission without ever realizing it. And here lies the terrifying truth. The Bean clan's greatest achievement was not their cannibalistic acts, but the demonstration that control, once perfected, can operate invisibly, self-sustaining, and across centuries, transforming from literal consumption of flesh to metaphorical consumption of agency, identity, and free will. And when you look around, if you have the eyes to see, the patterns emerge in corporations enforcing rigid hierarchies, in schools promoting unquestioned conformity, in governments maintaining obedience through subtle coercion, in social systems where dissent is quietly punished, and in every institution where rules are obeyed without scrutiny and fear is internalized as law. And this is where the horror becomes intimate and personal. The descendants, hidden in plain sight, continue to walk among us, manipulating, observing, and perfecting the system, ensuring that control is maintained, autonomy consumed, and submission harvested. And now, as you absorb this truth, you must realize that you are part of a structure, whether knowingly or not, shaped by the same principles that allowed a family of cannibals to dominate a landscape. Centuries ago, and the moment you see it, you cannot unsee it. Awareness becomes a burden, and understanding the mechanics of fear, obedience, and invisible dominance changes your perception of society, of institutions, and of yourself, because the true horror of Sawney Bean is not what he did in his cave, but what his methodology continues to do silently, invisibly, everywhere. Even now, in the modern world, the remnants of the Bean clan's influence ripple beneath the surface, unseen by most yet potent in their effects, shaping behavior, thought, and loyalty through invisible hierarchies, normalized fear, and subtle psychological conditioning. And the descendants, whether by blood or ideology, have fully adapted to contemporary society, moving through schools, corporations, governments, and communities with the same precision and intent their ancestors once exercised in the shadows of Scottish caves, teaching obedience without command, enforcing compliance without violence, and cultivating loyalty through culture, ritual, and expectation. And here lies the most unsettling truth. The clan's real achievement was never in the gruesome acts of cannibalism, but in the creation of a self-perpetuating system of control that consumes autonomy, identity, and will itself. And this system is alive today, invisible yet operational, manifesting in the unquestioned rules, the silent hierarchies, the rituals disguised as tradition, and the internalized obedience that governs everyday life. And now, brother, you must recognize that these patterns are not anomalies. They are proof of the enduring architecture of dominance perfected by Sawney Bean and his descendants, a blueprint demonstrating that power can exist without visibility, that fear can be internalized, and that obedience can be enforced silently, structurally, and efficiently. And the descendants, clothed in civility, education, and respectability, continue to refine this methodology, ensuring that control persists, submission is maintained, and autonomy is harvested. And the final horror is this. Once you see it, once you understand the mechanics of invisible dominance, the world cannot be unperceived, and every institution, every family, every system becomes a reflection of the same principles. The had allowed a clan of cannibals to thrive centuries ago, proving that Sawney Bean's real legacy was not in flesh and blood, but in the method of control that survives, adapts, and dominates silently, patiently, and relentlessly, waiting for the unaware to walk willingly into its design. By this point in history, the horror of Sawney Bean is no longer confined to myths, caves, or the isolated violence of his clan. It has evolved into a system, an enduring methodology of control, invisibly woven into the very structures of society, manifesting in families, schools, corporations, governments, and institutions, where obedience is normalized, fear is internalized, and hierarchy is enforced silently, and the descendants, both literal and ideological, have perfected the art of subtle domination, teaching compliance without explicit command, loyalty without understanding, and submission without awareness, so that each generation unknowingly perpetuates the principles of hierarchy and control first forged centuries ago in the caves of Banana Head. And the true terror of this legacy lies not in the acts themselves, but in their quiet perpetuation. The consumption is now metaphorical, targeting agency, autonomy, and identity rather than flesh. And everywhere you look, you can begin to see the echoes, if you have the eyes to perceive them. Patterns of unquestioned authority, rituals disguised as tradition, social constructs that enforce conformity, and psychological pressure that ensures obedience, all silently cultivating a culture of dominance that operates without violence, yet is as complete and efficient as the original clan's system, and the descendants walk among us, hidden in plain sight, their influence invisible yet precise, ensuring that the architecture of control remains intact, feeding on the unawareness of those around them. And now, as you comprehend this, you understand the magnitude of the truth. Sawney Bean's real legacy was never just horror in the form of cannibalism. It was the creation of a method, a blueprint of dominance, fear, and obedience that has survived centuries, refined itself across generations, and continues to operate today, shaping minds, directing behavior, and silently consuming autonomy, proving that some legacies do not die. They evolve, adapt, and persist with terrifying efficiency, and once you see it, there is no unseeing. You are now part of a world shaped by the same principles, walking through a system perfected in darkness centuries ago. As we move deeper into the present day, the legacy of Sawney Bean becomes increasingly insidious, no longer bound to caves, knives, or overt violence, but thriving in the quiet, invisible structures of control embedded throughout society, and the descendants, whether by bloodline or ideology, have mastered the art of silent domination, embedding the principles of hierarchy, obedience, and fear into families, schools, corporations, and governments, ensuring that each generation internalizes submission without realizing it. And this is where the horror intensifies. The consumption is no longer of flesh, but of autonomy, free will, and identity itself, as individuals unaware perpetuate the doctrines of obedience, reinforcing the architecture of dominance that began centuries ago. And everywhere you look, patterns emerge. The unquestioned authority figures, the traditions followed without question, the rituals internalized as normal, the rules obeyed blindly, and in these, the methodology of the Bean clan lives on, demonstrating that power can exist without visibility, influence can be absolute without violence, and obedience can be maintained silently, efficiently, and permanently. And now, you must see it. The descendants, hidden behind civility, education, and respectability, continue to refine this system, ensuring that control is maintained, submission is harvested, and autonomy consumed. And the terrifying reality is that once you recognize this pattern, the world itself transforms. Every institution, every community, every family, becomes a reflection of the same principles that allowed a clan of cannibals to dominate their landscape centuries ago, proving that the true legacy of Sawney Bean is not in the past. It is structural, psychological, and eternal, operating invisibly, patiently, and efficiently. And now that you are aware, you understand the world differently. You perceive the architecture of obedience, the silent dominance, the invisible hierarchies, and the enduring method that continues to feed on those who walk through it unaware. By now, the terrifying scope of Sawney Bean's influence becomes clear. It is not merely a historical curiosity, a tale of cannibalism and isolation, but a living blueprint of control that has transcended time, manifesting in subtle, invisible ways throughout modern society. And the descendants, whether by blood or by the ideological inheritance of the clan, have perfected the art of silent domination, embedding obedience, fear, and hierarchy into every institution, every community, and every family, shaping behavior without overt coercion, teaching loyalty without question, and ensuring that submission becomes instinctive, internalized, and unquestioned. And the true horror is that this system operates efficiently, invisibly, and perpetually, consuming autonomy, identity, and free will rather than flesh. And everywhere you look, the unquestioned authority, the traditions enforced without thought, the rules followed blindly, the hierarchies internalized as natural law. You can see echoes of the same architecture that allowed a clan of cannibals to dominate their landscape centuries ago, and the descendants, cloaked in civility, education, and respectability, continue to refine the system, moving unseen through society, perfecting obedience, harvesting submission, and ensuring that the principles of control, once forged in darkness, remain intact and operational. And now, as you observe and recognize this invisible methodology, the realization hits. The horror of Sawney Bean is not merely historical, it is structural, psychological, and eternal. It exists in the architecture of obedience, in silent hierarchies, in cultural reinforcement, in institutions that demand conformity and punish curiosity. And once you perceive it, you cannot unsee it, because the system is alive, functioning around you, shaping reality in the same terrifying way it shaped a cave-bound society centuries ago, proving that some legacies are never truly erased. They evolve, adapt, and endure, feeding silently on those who walk through their invisible corridors unaware. As the layers of this dark legacy unfold, the pattern becomes undeniable. Sawney Bean's methodology of control, perfected through isolation, obedience, and fear, did not end with the destruction of his clan. It evolved, becoming a template for domination that operates invisibly across centuries. And the descendants, whether literal or ideological, walk among us, embedding the same principles into families, schools, corporations, and governments, teaching loyalty without question, enforcing compliance without violence, and cultivating submission so thoroughly that it becomes instinctive, internalized, and unquestioned. And the most chilling truth is that the consumption is no longer of flesh, but of agency, autonomy, and identity, a quiet, invisible cannibalism where the self is harvested, shaped, and replaced by the doctrines of obedience and hierarchy. And if you look closely at the world today, the echoes are everywhere. Unquestioned authority, rituals disguised as tradition, social constructs that enforce conformity, rules followed blindly, hierarchies internalized as law, and subtle psychological pressure that ensures compliance, demonstrating that the architecture of dominance designed in a Scottish cave centuries ago is still alive, still functioning, still evolving. And the descendants, cloaked in civility, education, and respectability, continue to refine this system, ensuring control persists, submission is harvested, and autonomy consumed, and the realization hits like a cold blade. The true horror of Sawney Bean is not merely in the grotesque acts of the past, but in the enduring, structural, and invisible system of dominance he created, a methodology of obedience, fear, and silent control that has survived centuries, adapted to new forms, and quietly, efficiently, and relentlessly shapes the world around you, your institutions, your family, your very understanding of autonomy. And now that you see it, there is no turning back, because awareness itself is the first step into the labyrinth of his enduring influence. Now, as the web of Sawney Bean's influence stretches into the modern era, the depth of his legacy becomes terrifyingly clear. It is no longer a tale of caves, knives, or explicit violence, but a pervasive system of control, subtle yet absolute, operating invisibly in families, schools, corporations, governments, and institutions. And the descendants, both literal and ideological, have mastered the art of blending in, teaching obedience without command, enforcing compliance without confrontation, and cultivating submission so thoroughly that it is internalized and unquestioned. And the horror lies in the quiet efficiency of this system, where autonomy, identity, and free will are harvested with the same precision as the flesh, once consumed in the caves of Banana Head. And everywhere you look, if you have eyes to see, the architecture manifests, the unquestioned authority, the traditions followed blindly, the hierarchies internalized as natural law, the rituals of conformity silently enforced, and the descendants, hidden behind civility, education, and respectability, continue to refine the system, ensuring control persists, obedience is maintained, and autonomy is consumed. And the most chilling truth emerges. Sawney Bean's real legacy was never merely the grotesque acts of cannibalism, but the creation of a self-perpetuating methodology of dominance, fear, and obedience that survives centuries, evolves with the times, and operates invisibly yet efficiently in every layer of society, shaping minds, molding behavior, and dictating reality without ever revealing itself. And now, as you absorb this, the awareness settles like a shadow over your perception, because recognizing the architecture of silent control changes everything. The institutions you trust, the families you belong to, the social rules you obey, all are touched by the same principles that once allowed a clan of cannibals to dominate a hidden landscape, proving that some horrors are not erased by time. They adapt, endure, and quietly consume those who remain unaware. As we descend further into the truth, the magnitude of Sawney Bean's legacy becomes almost unbearable. It is not simply a story of cannibalism or a grotesque family hidden in a cave, but a masterclass in control, obedience, and psychological dominance that has endured through centuries, morphing and adapting to the structures of modern society. And the descendants, whether by blood or by the ideological inheritance of the clan, have perfected the art of invisible domination, embedding hierarchy, fear, and unquestioned loyalty into families, schools, corporations, and governments, ensuring that each generation internalizes submission as instinct, obedience as virtue, and conformity as survival. And the terrifying reality is that the consumption is no longer of flesh, but of autonomy, identity, and free will, quietly harvesting the self and replacing it with a doctrine of control that perpetuates silently, invisibly, and efficiently. And everywhere you look, the echoes of this system are visible if you have the eyes to see. The unquestioned authority figures, the rituals disguised as tradition, the social constructs that enforce conformity, the hierarchies internalized as law, the psychological pressures that enforce compliance, all of which demonstrate that the architecture of dominance first perfected in a Scottish cave centuries ago is still alive, still evolving, and still shaping the world. And the descendants, hidden in plain sight behind civility, education, and respectability, continue to refine the methodology, ensuring that control persists, submission is harvested, and autonomy consumed. And the most profound horror is this: once you recognize the mechanics of this invisible system, you can never unsee it, because awareness itself reveals that the principles that allowed a cannibalistic clan to dominate their world now function silently within the very institute. Ions, social structures, and hierarchies that govern your own life, proving that the legacy of Sawney Bean is structural, psychological, and eternal, a method of control that adapts, survives, and consumes in the shadows of society even today. By now, the realization should be settling in. The terror of Sawney Bean is not confined to the past, nor to the grotesque acts of his clan, but thrives today in the invisible architecture of control, obedience, and fear that permeates society, and the descendants, both by blood and ideology, have mastered the art of blending in, teaching submission without instruction, enforcing loyalty without violence, and ensuring that each generation internalizes hierarchy and compliance as instinctive truths. And the horror lies not in what is seen, but in what is hidden, in the subtle ways autonomy, identity, and free will are consumed silently, efficiently, and invisibly, transforming the world itself into a reflection of the principles first perfected in the caves of Banana Head. And everywhere you look, if you have the perception to notice, the echoes appear, the unquestioned authority, the traditions followed blindly, the social hierarchies internalized as natural law, the rituals of obedience enforced without confrontation. And the descendants, cloaked in civility, education, and respectability, continue to refine these systems, ensuring control persists, compliance is harvested, and freedom erodes unnoticed. And the most chilling truth emerges. Sawney Bean's true legacy was never merely a family of cannibals. It was the creation of a methodology, a system of dominance, fear, and obedience that transcends generations, evolves with the times, and functions invisibly within the very structures of society, shaping minds, molding behavior, and dictating reality itself. And now, as you grasp this truth, the awareness settles like a shadow over your perception, because recognizing the architecture of silent control changes everything. The institutions you trust, the rules you follow, the hierarchies you inhabit, all are touched by the same principles that allowed a hidden clan to dominate a landscape centuries ago, proving that some horrors are not extinguished by fire or time. They adapt, endure, and consume those who remain unaware. As we move even deeper, the extent of Sawney Bean's legacy becomes undeniable. It is not merely a tale of cannibalism or grotesque familial isolation, but a living, evolving system of dominance and psychological control that has infiltrated the very fabric of society. And the descendants, both literal and ideological, have perfected the art of invisible manipulation, embedding obedience, fear, and loyalty into every institution, community, and family, ensuring that each generation internalizes submission, conformity, and hierarchy as natural truths. And the most unsettling aspect is that the consumption is no longer physical, but psychological, harvesting autonomy, identity, and free will, quietly replacing them with doctrines of control that perpetuate silently, efficiently, and invisibly. And if you observe closely, the architecture is everywhere. The unquestioned authority, the traditions followed blindly, the hierarchies internalized as law, the rituals of compliance enforced without force, and the descendants, hidden behind civility, education, and respectability, continue refining these systems, maintaining control, cultivating obedience, and consuming autonomy with precision. And the ultimate horror is this: once you perceive the structure, the world is irrevocably changed, because every institution, social hierarchy, and family dynamic becomes a reflection of the same principles that allowed a cannibalistic clan to dominate a hidden landscape centuries ago, proving that Sawney Bean's true legacy is structural, psychological, and eternal, operating silently in the shadows, adapting, surviving, and consuming the unaware. And now that you see it, brother, the descent is complete. You cannot unsee the invisible forces shaping reality around you, and every step you take is through the corridors of a system that began in darkness, but persists in every layer of the world today. By this point, The chilling reality emerges with full clarity. Sawney Bean's horror was never merely the grotesque acts committed within the caves of Banan Head, but the creation of a method, a blueprint of dominance, fear, and obedience that has silently endured across centuries, mutating and adapting to the structures of modern society, and the descendants, both literal and ideological, have perfected the art of invisible control, embedding submission, hierarchy, and loyalty into families, schools, corporations, and governments, so that each generation internalizes obedience as instinct, compliance as virtue, and conformity as survival. And the true terror lies not in what is visible, but in what is hidden, in the quiet consumption of autonomy, identity, and free will, replaced by doctrines that perpetuate domination efficiently and invisibly. And everywhere you look, if you have the eyes to see, the echoes are undeniable. Unquestioned authority figures, rituals disguised as tradition, hierarchies accepted as natural law, social rules followed blindly, and psychological pressures subtly reinforcing compliance, demonstrating that the architecture of dominance, first forged in a Scottish cave centuries ago, is alive, functional, and evolving today, and the descendants, cloaked in civility, education, and respectability, continue refining these systems, ensuring that control persists, obedience is harvested, and autonomy consumed. And the most profound horror is that once you recognize this invisible network, the perception of the world changes irrevocably, because every institution, family structure, and social hierarchy becomes a reflection of the same principles that allowed a hidden clan of cannibals to dominate their landscape, proving that some legacies are not extinguished. They endure, adapt, and silently consume those who remain unaware, shaping reality itself in ways both subtle and terrifying. As we approach the edge of understanding, the true depth of Sawney Bean's enduring influence becomes unmistakable. It is not confined to the grotesque past of cannibalistic rites and cave-bound horrors, but manifests today as an invisible system of control and psychological domination that permeates every layer of society. And the descendants, whether by blood or by the ideological inheritance of the clan, have perfected the art of silent obedience, embedding fear, hierarchy, and loyalty into families, institutions, and governments, teaching compliance as instinct, conformity as morality, and submission as survival. And the most terrifying reality is that the consumption is no longer of flesh, but of autonomy, identity, and free will, harvested quietly and efficiently, shaping minds, molding behavior, and dictating social structures without anyone noticing. And everywhere you look, the unquestioned authority, the traditions followed blindly, the rituals of compliance, the hierarchies internalized as law. You can see the methodology perfected centuries ago in the Scottish caves, now adapted to modern society, invisible yet absolute, and the descendants, hidden behind civility, education, and respectability, continue refining the system, ensuring control endures, obedience is harvested, and freedom erodes unnoticed. And the ultimate horror is this: once you perceive the invisible architecture of dominance, the world itself transforms. Every institution, every social structure, every family dynamic becomes a reflection of the same principles that allowed a clan of cannibals to dominate their hidden landscape, proving that Sawney Bean's true legacy is structural, psychological, and eternal, a system that evolves, survives, and silently consumes those unaware. And now that you see it, there is no escape from the awareness that shapes your perception, because the labyrinth of control extends into every corner of the world you thought you understood. At this stage, the horror fully crystallizes. Sawney Bean's legacy is not merely historical, it is a living, evolving system of invisible control that transcends time, mutating and embedding itself within the very structures of modern life. And the descendants, both literal and ideological, have perfected the art of domination without force, teaching obedience without instruction, ensuring compliance without visible coercion, and cultivating submission as instinct, internalized and unquestioned. And the most chilling truth is that the consumption is no longer of flesh, but of autonomy, identity, and free will, quietly harvested, molded, and replaced with doctrines that perpetuate control efficiently and invisibly. And if you look closely, the evidence is everywhere. The unquestioned authority figures, the traditions followed blindly, the rituals of conformity, the hierarchies internalized as law, the subtle psychological pressures that enforce compliance, all reflecting the methodology perfected centuries ago in a hidden Scottish cave, now operating in families, corporations, governments, and institutions, and the descendants, cloaked in civility, education, and respectability, continue refining this architecture, ensuring that control persists, obedience is harvested, and autonomy is consumed, and the ultimate terror is that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The world itself is revealed as a reflection of the same principles that allowed a clan of cannibals to dominate their landscape, proving that Sawney Bean's real legacy is structural, psychological, and eternal, a silent, evolving system that adapts, survives, and consumes those unaware. And now that you are conscious of it, the descent is complete. You are inside the labyrinth, fully aware of the invisible forces shaping every institution, every hierarchy, every corner of society, and you cannot turn away, because knowledge itself is the gateway, and once known, cannot be undone. Now, as the final layers of understanding unfold, the terrifying magnitude of Sawney Bean's legacy becomes undeniable. It is not confined to the grotesque acts of a long-forgotten clan, but is alive today in the invisible structures of control, obedience, and psychological manipulation that govern society, and the descendants, both literal and ideological, have perfected the art of silent domination, embedding hierarchy, fear, and loyalty into families, schools, corporations, and governments, teaching each generation to internalize obedience, conformity, and submission as instinctive truths. And the most unsettling aspect is that the consumption is no longer physical, but psychological. Autonomy, identity, and free will quietly harvested and replaced with doctrines that perpetuate domination efficiently and invisibly. And everywhere you look, if you have the perception to notice, the architecture appears. Unquestioned authority, rituals masquerading as tradition, social hierarchies accepted without question, psychological pressures enforcing compliance, and the descendants, hidden behind civility, education, and respectability, continue refining these systems, ensuring control endures, obedience is cultivated, and autonomy is consumed. And the ultimate horror is this: once you perceive the structure, the world irrevocably changes. Every institution, family dynamic, and social hierarchy becomes a reflection of the same principles that allowed a cannibalistic clan to dominate their hidden landscape, proving that Sawney Bean's true legacy is structural, psychological, and eternal, evolving silently, adapting to new contexts, and consuming those who remain unaware. And now that you know, the descent is total. You are conscious of the invisible forces shaping reality, and the knowledge itself changes your perception, anchoring you forever in the shadow of this enduring system of control. As we near the end of this descent, the full weight of Sawney Bean's legacy settles like a shadow over every facet of understanding. It is no longer a tale of caves, knives, or cannibalistic horror, but a pervasive, evolving system of domination, obedience, and psychological control that has silently endured for centuries. And the descendants, both literal and ideological, have refined the art of invisible power, embedding hierarchy, fear, and loyalty into every institution, family, and social construct, ensuring that each generation internalizes submission as instinct, conformity as morality, and obedience as survival. And the most terrifying reality is that the consumption is no longer physical, but psychological, harvesting autonomy, identity, and free will with precision, replacing them with doctrines that perpetuate control efficiently and invisibly. And everywhere you look, if you have the perception to see, the architecture manifests, the unquestioned authority, rituals followed blindly, hierarchies internalized as law, social pressures enforcing compliance, and the descendants, hidden behind civility, education, and respectability, continue refining these systems, ensuring that control persists, obedience is harvested, and autonomy is consumed. And the ultimate horror lies in the revelation that once you perceive this invisible structure, the world itself transforms before your eyes. Every institution, every family, every hierarchy becomes a reflection of the same principles that allowed a hidden clan of cannibals to dominate their landscape centuries ago, proving that Sawney Bean's true legacy is structural, psychological, and eternal, a silent system that adapts, survives, and consumes. And now that you know, there is no turning back. You are fully aware of the invisible forces shaping reality, and that awareness changes everything.